All right, so welcome. Thank you to all of you for coming to this, the fourth lecture of 2017 in the series that we here at the library are calling Scholar for Life. This is the 8th overall lecture since the series began in early 2018. And again, thank you for coming and choosing to spend your late summer evening with us here. The Scholar for Life is a lecture series presented by the Middleton Public Library in partnership with the UW-Madison Speakers Bureau. The series takes the Wisconsin idea as its starting point, and it aims to promote lifelong learning, intellectual curiosity, and engagement between academics and the community as a whole. Before I get into the introduction here, a couple of quick programming notes. The next lecture in this series, which will be the final one for this year, will take place on Thursday, November 2nd at 7 p.m. John Dunn, who works at the Center for the Investigation of Healthy Minds with Richard Davidson, he will discuss that center's interdisciplinary approach to the study of mindfulness. That, again, will be the final lecture of 2017 in this series. And we have some exciting lectures planned for 2018. Nothing is finalized, so I can't mention any names, but I'm really looking forward to them, and I know you're really going to enjoy them. I also want to remind you that the first 3 lectures from this year are available online. They're on YouTube. You can find the links to the videos at midlibrary.org/SFL, Scholar for Life. Okay. Tonight we are pleased to welcome Professor Laura Albert, and this talk is brought to us by a unique 4-way partnership that reflects the spirit of the Wisconsin idea. The 4 partners here are, of course, the library. We're hosting the event. We helped select the topic and invited the audience and, of course, provided the venue. The second partner is the UW-Madison Speakers Bureau. They coordinate speaker matchmaking and logistics and cover speaker travel costs. The third partner is, of course, Professor Albert, who we'd like to note with appreciation is volunteering her time to come and be with us this evening and share with us her expertise. The fourth partner in this 4-way partnership is all of you who contribute to this event and others like it by actively engaging with our speaker and with each other to strengthen our community. It's so great to see so many people here on a beautiful summer evening. The response to this series has been just overwhelming and more than I had expected when I started it last year. So I really do appreciate your support. Okay, our guest this evening is an assistant dean in the School of Engineering and an expert in the fields of operations research and advanced analytics. She earned her PhD in industrial engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and her research focuses on modeling and solving real-world discrete optimization problems with applications to homeland security, disasters, emergency response, public services, healthcare. She is also interested in sports analytics and bracketology, and writes the blog Punk Rock Operations Research at punkrockor.com. Please join me in welcoming Laura Albert.
Thanks for having me here. This is exciting. I'm actually a Middleton resident, so I've been in this room before, seen talks. The most recent time I was here was for the craft swap, and that was pretty exciting. So hopefully today's talk is almost that exciting. So my field is industrial engineering, and they told me to talk about applications of industrial engineering, so I kind of front-loaded my talk with that in case some of you were interested in what industrial engineers do. And I'm happy to answer questions at any time during the presentation. I did not realize that I would be a YouTube sensation after today, so I'll try to repeat the questions so that it's all recorded later on. Okay, but I am an industrial engineering professor and assistant dean by day, and it's a lot of fun. And I do have a secret double life that Jim just mentioned. I'm a blogger, I'm a bit of a bracketologist, and in my professional society of Informs, I'm the vice president of marketing, communication, and outreach. And so these are all things that I do, and they're a lot of fun. And, you know, professors get to have fun, too. And I also talk to the news a lot, so I'm really happy to come and talk to you. My research has a lot to do with public sector problems. I'm happy to be here at the library, but I've also done a number of things. Some of them are local, some of them are national. I was most recently at WPR talking about the history of aviation security, so hear about that a little bit today too. It's really fun for me to be able to talk about my research and the public sector. It's a great part of the job. People don't know what engineers do, and it's a great opportunity whenever they're interested to hear about math and engineering. It doesn't happen a lot. Usually it just happens when Powerball's in the news, but we do other, you can use math for other things too. All right, so this is kind of my outline of the talk, and I really wanted to explain a little bit about what industrial engineering is. I think everybody will learn something today. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the applications, and then I'll jump into my own applications. I use the word analytics a lot. I don't know, it's kind of, well, we'll talk about that during the talk. And I'll talk about some of my research in public sector and bracketology. And at the end, I want to talk about the future a little bit, and where I think we're going, and why what I do is useful, and why what my colleagues do is useful. So I started to try to explain what industrial engineering is, and I just made a word cloud actually of all the course offerings we have at UW-Madison in industrial engineering. You can see some words pop out, like engineering, obviously, but also analysis, optimization, modeling. If you drill down, you'll see quality, healthcare, manufacturing. These courses describe a lot of what our graduates do after they leave, and you can see all the different types of things they do. Right? So we don't necessarily make stuff, we make systems, and we design things to be more efficient, to be safer, to be better quality. And this kind of captures a little bit of what you do. There's a simpler way that I kind of describe what we do as industrial engineers, and I basically say if you hate waiting in line and you want to design a better system, you probably like industrial engineering. A lot of what we do actually deals with systems and efficiency and moving things around, whether those things are people or vehicles, or packages. In terms of what we do at UW-Madison, industrial engineers really design and analyze improved systems, kind of complex systems, and I'll have more to say about systems. So we do study systems. The typical systems that we study are things like inventory models, warehouses, supply chains, really moving things around. Also manufacturing, so we don't make things, we make the manufacturing process more efficient, better quality, safer. A big application area now is service systems, including things at the hospital, but all over the place. And we have a picture of people here that are potentially working in a call center. So I hate dealing with call centers, but call center optimization is a lot better because we're managing it. And of course, transportation. So I think big wins are things in the private sector. I have a picture of UPS here. They won the biggest analytics prize in my field last year for some of the improvements they did in terms of delivering packages. The other big win is on airlines and scheduling airlines. It's just amazing how that system works together, and also scheduling the crews. And then you have it all scheduled perfectly, and then weather happens, and then you have to fix it and adjust. And these are all things we can use math modeling for. And probably one of the biggest health employers now is in the healthcare industry. We have great medicine in this country, great healthcare, but the system itself is pretty inefficient and has a lot of room for improvement. And so there's a lot of engineering that goes into that. Our department at UW-Madison is pretty broad, and we divide what we do into 4 areas. So my area is decision science and operations research. It's like, it doesn't sound exciting, but hopefully by the end of today's talk, you'll believe me that it's exciting. It's really the science of making better decisions. And again, making decisions about systems. And that often involves designing better systems. The second area is manufacturing. The third area is human factors and ergonomics. And the fourth system is healthcare systems engineering. And there's a reason why that's a fourth area. Actually, my department is one of the first in the country to really use engineering principles in the healthcare setting. It goes way back. So we were kind of on that train before everybody else was. And one thing that's not so obvious in all these areas is that we really focus on the human side of engineering. We are designing of systems, and I'll have more to say about automation, But in all of these systems, you generally have a human in the loop somewhere. And so whatever you design, you need, when a human interacts with it, they need to like not totally screw it up. Or sometimes they need to actually implement the decision. And so we do things a little bit differently than if a human is not in the loop. Also, our ed curriculum broadly educates students. A lot of our students are interested in the business side of engineering, management. Understanding systems on a high level gives you a lot of a broad perspective, and students work in all sorts of industries after they graduate. All right, so that's enough of what we do at UW-Madison. I want to talk a little bit about some of the applications that I don't necessarily do early on, but that you might be interested in. So I think a lot of us are familiar with delivering packages around the globe, but there's a number of optimization and systems problems that go into this, from very high-level decisions about where they UPS or any company should locate their hubs. They usually have very few of these. Then they also have a number of other inventory decisions along the way, service centers, these warehouses that they have. And then I mentioned the analytics prize last year, and that was actually route optimization, so very much at the local level. And what was very interesting about that was that the driver actually had to implement the algorithm and possibly tweak it. And part of the solution was actually rewriting the map. So I use Google Maps almost daily for things, but it's not at all accurate enough if many of us have houses where the street address is on one street, but the actual driveways around the corner. And it really just screws things up if you're driving a giant truck trying to deliver packages. So there's fine details that they actually had to rewrite and improve. And at the end of the day, they have their drivers out there with an iPad trying to deliver the packages in a more efficient manner. And it's pretty incredible what they were able to accomplish. The optimization is kind of on all those different levels, from the global down to the very local. I wanted to talk about Disney because it's fun, but also my department had an alum come a couple years ago and talk about some of the things that they were doing at Disney. It was pretty interesting. At the time, they were doing these magic passes, these bracelets that were tied to your credit card, and just making the experience in the park very efficient in terms of buying things, but also very enjoyable. So again, the human side of engineering, when they'd scan your bracelet, your name would pop up to the clerk, and they'd be able to greet you and ask you about if you enjoyed your breakfast, and they knew what you ordered for breakfast, and it just made it a much more enjoyable experience. And having fun is part of the goal. And she also talked about Disney Shanghai and being able to design a park from scratch. And we think about going to the rides and waiting in line, and that's all part of it. But they also have things like beer optimization. You have to order the drinks, and you have to think about that supply chain. And it's a pretty complex decision, and that's what they have to do in the parks. And I do a little bit of work on disasters, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this. As I was preparing for this talk, a number of people asked me to talk about hurricanes. And of course, that's one type of weather disaster. But I borrowed this disaster cycle from FEMA because actually figuring out how to, as an engineer, manage disasters is there's a number of problems that are involved throughout the life cycle. So we'll start with kind of mitigation, which is what you do way ahead of time before a disaster. So if you don't want it to be damaging, you can design a system that cannot sustain as much damage. And so this is what we do a lot in the mitigation stage, is pre-planning. And it's really reducing that potential for harm. So a lot of my work falls in this area. As engineers, we design systems ahead of time, so this works pretty well. I'll talk about some of my research on checkpoint screening for aviation security, but this is also like pre-locating supply stations or medical facilities well in advance, knowing that something could happen, anything could happen, but we need to be ready. Preparedness is more like directly in front of an event. So with a hurricane, you know it's coming. You don't really know it's coming. With a tornado, you have a few minutes warning. But with hurricanes, you have a few days, and you can pre-locate supplies. They fly crews out ahead of time, especially for power loss. They'll fly from all over the country, and they'll pre-locate them at places where they'll be safe. And then the storm comes through, and then they're ready to go. And that's kind of our preparedness stage. And you can see that those decisions are a little bit different than what you do, mitigation that's way ahead of the time. Now the third area is response, which is really during and immediately after a disaster. And this includes things like urban search and rescue decisions, routing of relief and aid, and even like hospital evacuations. A lot lose power during weather events. And the goal here is to just protect the systems, respond to the emergencies as they happen, and maybe restore or maintain essential services. And then we get into the recovery stage, which is after the fact, which is basically getting the system back to normal. And this can take a long time, potentially. In disasters or in hurricanes, you're just looking at debris cleanup and removal. We don't really experience this in Wisconsin, but some of those areas in the coast, there's just debris that sits around for years, basically, after these events. And you have to immediately clear the roads, but there are longer-term planning issues. And ultimately, this is a cycle because what you should learn from the recovery stage should help inform your mitigation decisions for the next time around. So a lot of different types of engineers, of course, have to work on these problems. I chose examples that industrial engineers often do, but there's a lot of people that are involved at different stages of the life cycle. All right, so I want to talk a little, before I talk about my research, I want to talk about how studying systems. And I do study systems, and I didn't really define it earlier on. But a system is really a set of things, and they could be vehicles, as I alluded to earlier, people, systems of people, even cells, so there's systems biology. And I'll talk about basketball teams too. But they interact in a way that they produce their own behavior of time. And you can experience this when you drive on the highway. You yourself do not cause traffic. It's that interaction that you have with all the other drivers that produces traffic. And my field is called operations research. It's not the most exciting name, but it is really the science of making decisions on systems using advanced analytical methods. So it's usually math and math models. And I have a slinky here because it illustrates the system with interconnected parts. And so my field really grew out of World War II. That's when it became a thing, and it was really moving troops around, moving all the supplies around to support the troops on a transportation network. So we're back to those transportation problems. Before there was UPS, there was troops in World War II, and it was not really obvious at all what to do. And so math modeling made some improvements. And if you can just improve your bottom line by just a little bit in a wartime situation when the costs are enormous, there's some big savings there, and it really does add up and makes a huge difference. And so it's been a field of study ever since, and that's where the name comes from, operations research. It has a very military-like name. So I like this quote from Admiral Grace Hopper: "Life was simple before World War II. After that, we had systems." And I just want to give a shout out to Admiral Grace Hopper. She's a pioneer in computer science. I enjoyed Hidden Figures. There's a lot of women, pretty badass women in computer science. She was one. She invented the first compiler in COBOL. It was even on the David Letterman show, so it's pretty amazing for a researcher. So with that, I want to continue in terms of math modeling. So a lot of us know math, but math models are a little bit different. It's really where we look at the systems part and try to describe a system. And our world is very complicated. It's very complex. It's getting more complex. It was hard to describe actually what happened in the financial crisis, which was just a few years ago. And math models and systems thinking really just help us navigate this complicated world, but also make it better and improve some of what we know about it and what we can do about it. So that's just my pitch for the importance of math models today. This is a very old illustration of my Twitter network at one point. So social networks is a math model. All right, so where do data analytics fit in? So people ask me about data all the time, like, oh, data is so cool, but it doesn't really do anything. It's just there, it's just data, it's kind of cool. There's actually, people like me get asked about data so much. There's actually a Tumblr devoted to corny pictures of big data. So this is the Niagara Falls of big data. But it's just data, and really, I would say the goal is to turn the data to information. Like, we want to learn something about it. And these companies that are valued sometimes in the billions of dollars that basically collect data, especially social network data, they're valued because they have the potential on turning that data into something that's useful, like information. And I want to go a little bit further than this. I really want to make better decisions. Right? So I want to turn the data into information and then use that to make better decisions, so to design a better system. And so that's really what a lot of different people are using data for. I don't know how much you want to do about data, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit today. I'll have more to say about it too. And I took all the math out of my presentation, but I did not take all the charts out of my presentation. So some are coming Some are coming up. This is one of them. All right, so I tried to explain a little bit of how you categorize some of the different tools we have out there, because there's a lot of different tools for data. I mean, there's a lot you could do with it. There's a lot of problems we want to solve. But I have here on the bottom, we have data, then we have insight going up, and then we have decisions. I like making decisions. And then I have an x-axis too. I know I warned you there's a chart. It is past, present, and future. And I think this is an important distinction when I think about what we do in analytics and in engineering. And a lot of where we start is just down here in the corner, which is just looking at the data and trying to figure out what happened in the past. A lot of times it's not really obvious what happened if we don't have data to support something. We just have a bunch of anecdotes. The next question we might want to ask is, why did it happen? And so we can use more sophisticated tools. You might have, some of you I know about these, but statistical methods, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, data mining. If you've heard these terms, they're still pretty much looking at what happened in the past, but trying to gain a little bit more insight. We can look more into the future and ask what will happen. And these are a different set of tools. Forecasting and simulation are the most widely used here. And where I work is up here in this orange corner. What should we do? How do we design that better system? And it's getting to the decision part that we're trying to focus on, but it's also very much looking into the future. So this might be a little bit too detailed, and I promise I won't be at this level of detail the whole talk. But in what we talk about in analytics is we have descriptive analytics, which is just describing what happened in the past, which can be incredibly useful. We want to look into the future. We get to predictive analytics. We want to predict what will happen next. And ultimately, if we want to look at designing a better system, we're prescribing. We're looking at doing prescriptive analytics. And so a lot of what we hear in data science is mostly in the descriptive analytics toolbox. And so different people do different work on different problems, and they're all important. But my focus is in that orange box. And one other thing that I want to talk about, I don't get to talk about what it's like to be an engineer very often, so I'm very excited. But the data itself, they were collected in the past. They describe the past. They describe what happened in the past. They are very much looking backward. But as engineers, we want to look into the future. It's all about designing something for the future. And it's just a very different focus and mindset. And usually, even in engineering, we don't talk about this a lot, but it really describes a lot of what we do, what I do as a professor, and what my students go on to do as engineers. All right, so I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about what I do a little bit. If there are any burning questions, I'm happy to answer them. I've been doing a lot of talking. Keep going. All right, I'm on a roll, so I'll keep going. So I want to talk a little bit about my research in aviation security. And I will talk a little bit about the past, and then I'll kind of interject where my work comes in. I took the math out, I promise. But this is, I have some cartoons, because aviation security is a very public issue. We talk about it a lot. Not all security problems do we care about this deeply. This is apparently a New Yorker cartoon from 1938. We've been talking about aviation security for a long time. I love talking to undergraduates about aviation security, and I show them this picture, and I ask them to guess what year it came out in. And they always guess the 80s, because the 80s is like ancient history to them. And it's like they just throw that out as like a date that happened way in the distant past, and it makes me really sad. But I will talk about the history. So before 1970, there really wasn't a whole lot of aviation security at all. There were a number of hijackings that occurred. The big one was in 1968, and this was like social contagion almost. There were many hijacking attempts after this. Got so much publicity on TV. It just really encouraged copycats. And there wasn't much of a response. So at some point we had to intervene and make some changes. And they were pretty much minor changes. So surveillance, air marshals. So if you actually flew, you might not have known that anything changed, right? So as you can imagine, this didn't really discourage hijacking attempts. They still occurred. So it was really 1972 where armed guards, so now at least the security there is visible, it's pretty minor, and then all passengers were screened. And I looked this up, and some of it was just a behavioral profile or an ID check. So it was pretty low security. And it was at the end of 1972, which we kind of when aviation security, as many of us knew it for many years, really started. And this is where people were going through metal detectors. I have more New Yorker cartoons. They've been really faithful to me over the years. But this is in 1972, and you can't really read it, but it says, there's a bunch of people walking on the plane, and they're naked, and it says, it is humiliating, Alice, but it is foolproof, you have to admit. And this happened just before the metal detector. So this change was in the works, and it just seemed like such a terrible thing to ask people to go through this metal detector that it was like asking them to fly naked. And we laugh because of what's happened since, right? So it's all relative to where people are at. Okay, so not a whole lot happened for 24 years, but something did happen in 1996. And again, it was one of these changes that was behind the scenes, and a lot of people weren't very much aware of it. And this was basically due to Pan Am Flight 103 and spurred by TWA Flight 800. So Al Gore recognized that what happened in Pan Am Flight 103 is that somebody checked a bag, there was a bomb in it, they didn't get on the plane, and then the bomb went off. They thought initially that happened in TW Flight 800. It wasn't the cause, but it did cause a change in aviation security in this country. And it was really screening checked bags for explosives. So this happened at some point after 1996, but only a small fraction were screened. So it's something that was very scalable. This is another thing that we think about in engineering. We can't scale it up to everybody, but we can handle like 5% of very risky passengers, and that's very doable. And so there was a change there. And then we have September 11th. We had to declaw the cat down there. We had all sorts of changes. And what happened was that we created the TSA. So actually there were federal screeners screening passengers, but it required all checked bags to be screened for explosives. Now, if you might have noticed that the hijackers on September 11th didn't have checked bags. So this seems like a kind of a puzzling policy change. And the reason was because there was some history behind that we had some technology to screen some checked bags for explosives. And so the obvious solution was, let's just screen them all. And then there were some other changes to actual carry-on policy that changed over time. Wait, so some of those. I want to mention a little bit about these screeners. So this is a picture of these screeners. They used to be in airport lobbies. They weigh 9 tons. That's a lot. And now they're all behind the scenes with conveyor belts. But they were only made by 2 manufacturers, right? So again, looking at scaling up to all 450 some airports, all the passengers, 2 manufacturers could not possibly make all of these devices, right? Like just simple supply chains, back of the envelope calculation, that was kind of impossible. So that was one of the challenges. And even if they could, these machines weighed 9 tons. How many of them can you put in an airport lobby before it collapses? You know, we don't want to find out. But there were some real challenges in a very short timeline for making these decisions. These are all things that I think about as an engineer when these things happen. The technology was slow. In part, it was slow because we did not have the series of conveyor belts to move bags around. So even with the same technology, with all these conveyor belts, they can have twice the throughput. You know, there's ways to make them more efficient. But I remember even in Reagan Airport for a long time, you'd have to like pop your bag in manually in the lobby, and it was so crowded. It was like single file traffic, and the system was really bursting at the seams.
So why do we have to be that heavy? Is it because they have a lot of lead or some other metal?
Yeah, so this one does a lot of like advanced imaging for the possibility of explosives. And it's just the technology is incredibly heavy. I don't know the specific, I don't think, it's not lead, but there are similar materials in there to do all the imaging. Yeah. All right, so I mentioned that they have these big, heavy, slow machines that aren't actually all that good, but they had about 14 months to get them all out there screening bags, again, just checked bags, and they wanted to do it fast. And so the TSA's always had this goal of like 10 minutes, and we want really great security, but like the reality is that our economy depends on us being able to move people, goods around rather efficiently. So we don't want people to wait in line too long. And of course, you know, they didn't actually need it, but what they did was very haphazard and piecemeal. They ended up swabbing bags for a while. This is incredibly labor intensive, and the workforce really swelled. It was very expensive. And then eventually it took years and years to get what they wanted to happen. And it did work, right? But we had these years of this plan B in transition to get to this point. And we want a system that still works in the meantime, right? That's what some of the things engineers can do. All right, so a few other changes occurred. We had the shoe bomber, so we've been removing shoes since December 2001. Doesn't seem like it's been that long, but it has. In 2002, it was very interesting because we started hearing about risk-based security. And a lot of my research was on risk-based security. I should say that I started the PhD program in September 2001, and my advisor happened to be one of the very few people that had been researching aviation security before then. So it's a big reason why I got involved in this problem. And very much in the Al Gore school of thought about just targeting resources at the riskiest passengers. And the reason they did that before September 11th was because there wasn't buy-in to screen everybody. But there ended up being so many changes after September 11th that seemed like a good strategy. You just have different resources and different costs. August 2006 is when the liquids were not allowed. And then we have the explosive trace portals that you could walk through. So this is, the imaging software. That was pretty interesting. So this is another cartoon. This is that game Operation. And finally we have, in 2012, we finally see less screening. So mainly for children and seniors. It took a while. It took more than a decade. Before then, most of the screening was just ramping up. And then in December 2013, TSA PreCheck. Okay, so really less screening for the average passenger. And I would argue that TSA PreCheck does a pretty good job of keeping the system efficient but also effective. So most of my research focused on the logistics and how to match passengers with resources. And I want to point out a few things about why these are good engineering problems. Actually, making the devices is a good engineering problem, but I study more of the system, so I'll talk about that. One is that we have limited resources. We live in a world with limited resources. We always would like to do more, but we can't. We have to use our limited resources wisely. And this is one of the things that we can use math models to help us make decisions and make us feel good about how to use our limited resources. We also have passenger risk assessments. Some passengers could be viewed as riskier than others, some we know a lot about. I just mentioned seniors and children. These are all things that can go into our decision making. We also have trade-offs. Decisions are all about the trade-offs that you can live with. Here we have efficiency, some kind of measure of effectiveness, which is security in this case, and cost. And yes, we'd like to have really great security, and I think we have pretty good security. The TSA has always had this goal of waiting in line for less than 10 minutes. There's a lot of costs of passengers missing their flights, and they just want people to have not a miserable experience when they go to the airport. And so 10 minutes has always seemed like a reasonable goal. It's like 10 minutes on average, right? And the last one is that the system is always changing. We have different technology, we have different requirements, so we always need to figure out what to do to meet this moving target that we have that's been placed in front of us. And kind of analytical tools help us deal with all these issues and address these challenges. So a lot of my research is focused on risk-based screening, both of check bags and of passengers. When I was a PhD student, this Playmobil toy of a checkpoint security station came out. People really were interested in aviation security for a while. But what really focused on what math models can tell us about matching passengers and these limited resources, limited security resources. And so we did a lot. I'm trying to skip the models here, but we looked at what we can learn about this, especially when operating in real time. So we can kind of get it right in real time, or we know that the system will make some mistakes, and we can look at under-screening and we can look at over-screening. So I'm not so concerned about over-screening. We've all been over-screened before, life goes on, but we don't want the riskiest passengers under-screened. And so we can look at things like false alarms and false clears and try to characterize what will happen and draw conclusions and policy insights to help design a better system. But it really comes from the fact that the security resources are limited. That's one of the assumptions that we've used when doing the work. And that's been a helpful framework because they are pretty limited. We do want to get it right. Of course, we always want to get it right. it's really tough to do. We know very little about passengers when they fly, and we do risk assessments. They're done not perfect. We're limited by the security resources available at the time the passenger flies. These are all things that are really challenging to design a good system. One of the things that came out of our research is, what happens if we get it wrong? What if we, for example, overestimate the risk in the system? We think anything could be a risk. Well, this is a good recipe for not making the best decisions. Security events, thankfully, are very rare. If we think anything can be a risk, what happens is we think any passenger can be a risk, and it's very difficult for us to match the passengers with the type of resources that would be appropriate, right? And so that means sometimes we'll underscreen the high-risk passengers. But it's very natural to overestimate and think anything could be a risk. On the flip side, if we err on the side of underestimating risk, which is also a mistake, what we think is that very few passengers pose a risk, but we're still able to recognize the riskiest ones and at least get that matching right. And so this is, in some ways, a better mistake to make. It's a little bit more robust in that your high-risk passengers are still really identified as high-risk passengers and are matched with more security resources. Some of the key observations in this work is that, everybody wants to eliminate risk. It cannot be done. You just manage it, you reduce it. You try to design systems that do that pretty well. I try to describe it in terms of aviation security is just making a smaller haystack, right? There's a lot that we don't know. The information's really imperfect, but we don't want to think everybody can be a risk. We really want to target the resources at a smaller haystack, know that we're going to get it wrong, and we're going to think a lot of people are maybe riskier than they are, but if we have a smaller haystack, we can make better decisions. TSA PreCheck I've been kind of positive about, mainly because they approved my application, but it really does focus on this, that we have limited resources, and it's better to focus these resources on the risky passengers. And what it does is it really tries to send passengers who are obviously pretty low risk into a separate line, if they're willing to kind of pay for this service. And that's one way to just make a smaller haystack. And I mentioned that security is a moving target, and it's always worth pointing out that good security 5 years from now will look really different than what we think good security is right now. And I went through all the changes we've seen. It's hard to imagine, what we were, 5 years ago, we were just getting used to these trace portals, right? So security really has changed in a fairly short period of time. All right, so this is some of my work that goes way back. I wanted to change gears and talk about managing risk in other systems. And a lot of my work actually deals with emergency response and actually response to 911 calls, mostly with emergency medical services. Oh, there's a question here. Thank you.
Well, just before this,
Mhm.
the summer's age, what's the criteria?
Oh, that also, the question is what's the criteria for high risk, and that also is changing a lot. I don't know, it's classified, different people have worked on that. I tried to treat that more as a black box in my research, but the system is called DARMS, D-A-R-M-S, Dynamic Aviation Risk Management System maybe, and it looks at a bunch of information. So they've looked at this on September 11th, how many were targeted as high risk, and it's been uncertain. It was like 6 to 14 of the 19 passengers. But random chance would say that a system would only identify one of the hijackers as random chance. So it's not perfect, but it's better. And those are kind of like the numbers and insights we get. They've gotten better at it. So I think buying a one-way ticket used to be a red flag. It's no longer a red flag or being higher risk. That's not incredibly savvy. So usually the more you know, the more certain they are that you're not at risk. And it's kind of the way that it's been described to me. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about managing risk in emergency medical service systems. So this has been really fun because, there aren't a lot of homeland security incidents. It's not a very data-rich environment for a lot of my research, but there's a lot of data with 911 calls, and it's exciting, and it's fun, and it's great to know that some of my work has made a difference. I did try to, again, I took out a lot of the math. But some of the research questions I've asked are, what's the best system goal for responding to emergency calls? I'll talk about this one a little bit. So they always measure performance in terms of response times. The second type of question that I've asked in my research is, well, how do we then use that goal to design response systems better? Basically send ambulances, sometimes a combination of vehicles to prioritize patients in real time. I've also looked at questions about what's the best mix of vehicles to use for responding to calls, and I've also looked at severe weather. So I did a paper on snowstorms, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but and that was in Virginia, and they drive so much worse in snow than they do in Wisconsin. So that was important work. But in terms of response time, so this is an interesting idea about systems thinking. So I started working in emergency medical services, and I started working with the emergency doctor, and he was telling me his findings. And this guy was brilliant, just a brilliant emergency doctor who was the medical director. And he was very concerned in the data because they have this 9-minute response time, which is very common in fire and emergency medical service systems, where by the time they send the ambulance when you're on the phone to the time when they arrive should be under 9 minutes. And it's been under 9 minutes for a while. And he noticed from the call logs that most of the time they're arriving in like 8 to 9 minutes. It's like, well, if you have a cardiac arrest, you'll probably die before then. So why don't they just make a better goal of like 5 minutes, and then somehow they'll figure out how to get there in like just under a minute before the 5-minute goal. But now the patients will survive. And I'm like, well, that sounds like a great idea. Of course I want people to survive. Of course we want there in less than 5 minutes. But I've driven places, and I'd like to get there faster, and it doesn't really work that way. You're driving on the roads. And so I ended up working on 2 papers that examined this idea. And one thing to notice, if you change the goal from 9 minutes to 5 minutes, people will do things very differently. They respond to those incentives that you have if you're going to measure their performance. And they might do things differently. And we could understand what that might be, measure it, and then retrospectively look at, how would people have survived with different goals. So I looked at a bunch of different goals, so I kind of drew them all out here. And it was actually really interesting. So we know from the medical science that you really need to get there in under 5 minutes. But yet, systems have this 9-minute goal that the doctor said was a death sentence. When I actually looked at it from the math models, I found that the doctor was wrong. I proved him wrong mathematically, but that 8 minutes was the best goal. And 7 to 9 minutes were really great goals too. And what was really interesting about this is it really took into account that what we're trying to do in emergency medical service systems is manage the system, whereas the doctor was managing a patient one at a time. So something very much at the individual level. And of course, for survival, you need to get there in under 5 minutes, but that's not a good goal for the system. And that these things need to be a little bit different. So that was some really interesting research that nobody had really studied before. So again, it's a systems decision.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
If the goal is to save the patient, why is the system different than the goal of 5 to 9 minutes?
Yeah, so what happens if you were to locate ambulances is you just give up on saving most people, and you just locate them in a couple of areas with the highest population density, right? And a different goal helps you sort of take into account that you don't really know where the next patient is going to be. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I still understand how that same patient, the average time is 8 to 9 minutes, the cardiac arrest patient is dead.
Right, but if that is a system goal, sometimes you'll get there way before the 8 or 9 minutes. And what happens if the goal is 5 minutes is that you get there under 5 minutes a little bit more, but you also get there like 15 or 20 minutes a lot more. Yeah, so there's like a sweet spot in the middle. Mm-hmm.
This being the public,
Yes.
if you start with 5 minutes goal, if you don't reach,
Mm-hmm.
it will be much more bad in the other 9 minutes.
So if you don't okay, can you repeat the
If
question?
you're not able to still reach the person in 5 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, then it's not a good model.
That could be. It's not good PR. I agree. So we looked at people, and when I give talks, people often complain about how long ambulances take to reach them, and they would survive either way. But it is good PR to get there quicker and to deliver public services to most in a reasonable amount of time. And the 9 minutes does that pretty well too. Mm-hmm.
Was the goal biologic survival or neurologic? Neurologic function.
It is a survival to hospital discharge. I'm not going to choose it. All right, these are good questions. All right, so this is some of the work. I did some other work that then looks at which ambulance to send. So there's different types of, I won't get into all the details today, but there are different types of vehicles and different types of service providers. You have paramedics and EMTs, and even fire engines will respond to calls. And there are some guidelines, but if you're looking at optimizing resources on a network, you often have a choice of like which paramedic to send. And that's where optimization is a really good tool for understanding those decisions in real time, even with imperfect information about what the patient on the other side might actually need. And again, it's just looking at managing risk in a system, managing scarce resources. If you send an ambulance to a call, they're there, you can't take them off that call and send them to somewhere else. They have to take care of that first patient they're at. But we have a spatial network. Patients and vehicles are spatially dispersed. And that makes the decisions a little bit tougher. And basically, how does this work? It's a little bit tricky, but usually it's when that closest ambulance isn't available and you have to go to your second choice. That's always not a very obvious decision. And also, if we look at the lower priority patients and trying to manage them, we don't want patients to wait too long. But if they could wait another minute, if you could potentially up the likelihood of saving the life of the next patient, that is usually where an opportunity for a better decision. These aren't very obvious. This is why we build math models and do optimization. All right. I'm running out of time, but I do want to talk about one thing that was actually implemented, so I'm pretty excited about this. And so I worked at this county early on, and they wanted to replace ambulances with basically SUVs that they called quick response vehicles. And the idea was that you would have one paramedic in an SUV versus two in the ambulance. So you can get like two vehicles for one. The downside was that the SUVs couldn't take patients to the hospital. And you have to get patients to the hospital. So there was some doubling up with an ambulance, at least at the scene. And sometimes they would have to double up all the way to the hospital. So that service provider, the paramedic on the SUV would have to like hop onto the ambulance, and then you tie up all three of them. So there were some pros and cons of doing this. And we ended up like building a math model to understand what would happen. And this was also during a time where property, basically the county wasn't getting a lot of extra money. The economy wasn't in great shape. So they needed to figure out how to improve public services without any extra money. So we were able to do it. Basically, the optimization model suggested that this is a good deal. If you're dispersing your vehicles on a network, you want to spread them out a little bit more. And you can do this, and there's some loss of efficiency, but the pros outweigh the cons. And I'll skip all the details, but we did, this is actually pretty complicated when we look at these issues of the right mix of vehicles. But we were able to do it and show some results. So this is one of my figures in the paper, too. Without any extra cost, we were able to improve the fraction of calls that are responded to in that 9-minute time frame from 75 to 80%. And that's a huge improvement for no extra cost. You usually can't get something for nothing. So we did this, and we actually won an award. It was the National Association of Counties Achievement Award winner for Next Generation Emergency Medical Response through Data Analysis and Planning. So that was kind of fun. And it all originated from the fire and EMS chief who just wanted to do better, was willing to try something new. All right, so
did you try that just for the medicine or with the county or who did all?
Oh yeah, it's through the county. So most of these EMS systems, emergency medical service systems, are at the local level, and most are a combination fire and EMS. So it was just through the county.
So it involved the whole area.
It did.
So we're talking about math model open and how to test it. Are you doing some simulation before applying?
Oh yeah, in this case, they didn't take my exact solution, but yeah, you do have to try to test it and somehow, and usually it's collecting some data. Usually you do a lot of optimization and scenario planning ahead of time before really implementing it in real time. But in terms of like travel times, there's not too many surprises. You could simulate too. That's a good question. There's different ways you could test it. All right, so I wanted to talk about bracketology a little bit. This has been kind of fun. This is like my fun pet project since getting tenure. I wanted something fun to do. And I came to Wisconsin, and a year later, somebody mentioned that there's going to be a college football playoff. You should do something. And so I was really excited because I teach some classes that use certain methods, and I wanted to tie in those methods. And I wanted to actually forecast who would be in the college football playoff. So I wanted to be able to recognize who the top 4 teams would be, but then also understand their path to the playoffs based on the schedule. And so we see that this is pretty important for football because not every team is created equal. Some schedules are very tough, and as you get closer to the end of the season, sometimes the remaining schedule is very tough. And then there's, of course, the conference championship games. So I started working on this, and it's been a lot of fun. And I will mention the method that I base this on, which is Markov chains, which is what I teach in a couple of my classes. And this is a specific type of math model, and it's really for understanding how a system evolves and maybe predicting what will happen next. And the Markov chain is really used in a number of applications. It's most commonly used in finance to model the stock market, in epidemiology to model the spread of disease. It's also models the science of waiting in line, queues, and even you can use it for like a zombie apocalypse. So I've got that going for me. So it's a really handy math model. I wanted to tie this into what I do in the classroom too, and it could be used to rank sports teams. And, of course, ranking sports teams is fun, but that's not really the goal. The goal is to really talk about how we can draw conclusions from very limited data. So the college football season is about 12 games long, so it's pretty limited in terms of the data that we have. And we also want to learn how to make data-driven decisions in the presence of uncertainty. And so it's just a great vehicle for getting students to make the connections. So it's been kind of fun. This is a graph of the college football season. So I'll try to explain what the Markov chain does in a really high level. And so you can see all the connections, and you can see the conference games that happen, these clusters. So there's some network structure and topology. But the idea is that you have a connection, like a two-way connection, possibly between these teams, and you can move team to team. You only can move team to team if they play, and you move probabilistically to one of the teams that beat that team, right? So a team's votes for the teams that it loses to. And if you're looking for Wisconsin, there's Wisconsin. But the idea in this is that you will tend to move to teams that win some games, and you'll you'll visit over time, if you let this run for a long time, to the teams that win the most games. You visit them the most often, right? Because you're more likely to move there. And this helps us rank those teams, and we can take strength of schedule into account and look at this. And it works pretty well. And what's really neat is that you don't really need a lot of data to do this pretty well. It accounts for strength of schedule. I don't have to come up with a formula. So we've seen some of the formulas that exist out there, and they don't work very well. You also don't need a human in the loop. So I do simulate the rest of the football season, and I can recognize the top 4 teams. I don't have to look at every simulation, every 1,000 of these simulations, and guess who I think the top team would be. And we have some simple requirements. So I want to teach with this, so I just look at game outcomes, where the game was played, and the score differential. Okay. A lot of my students think football is a different sport. So I want to be able to talk about this and have that make sense to them. And they understand score differentials and home field advantage. We'll specifically talk about the football forecast and looking at the rest of the season. Today I'll just talk about ranking sports teams. And I will say that Markov chain works really well. And if this idea seems familiar to you, and it may or may not, but Google's PageRank algorithm uses Markov chains to again identify, to make good decisions with the information that you have. So what they do is something very similar. Instead of a team beating another team, they look at who you link to on a website, and this is determines who you vote for. And that's how they identify who has the knowledge. There's the most incoming links. And it works really well. I mean, Google changed our way of life. It's just a simple algorithm, but searches before that were really bad. I mean, do you remember how rough it was to find information before Google? It was pretty rough. So Markov chains can be pretty powerful, and they've tweaked PageRank over the years, but it's a pretty great algorithm. In terms of ranking basketball teams, I'll try to just talk about the data a little bit and then the insights we get. So what I do is I try to tweak the algorithm to account for that vote that they get, and they have a split vote. You could vote for the losing team, but you have to give a partial vote. So the question is, how much partial credit should you give a team based on an outcome? So this is a simple example. So in basketball, the teams play twice a season in the same conference quite often, so we can look at that. And so for example, I think this is the year before last, Wisconsin beat Rutgers by 20 points, and it was at Wisconsin. So that's what I would look at in terms of the data, a 20-point differential, and it was Wisconsin's home court. And the question is, how much credit should Wisconsin get? And if we do this in a data-driven manner, we might get a different solution than our gut. So I think Wisconsin should get a lot of credit, but the data suggests something otherwise. This is my one of my last incomprehensible charts. But I took a vertical slice here, and this is just like all the data from at least 2 seasons worth, and I just did a scatter plot. And so this vertical slice is teams that win at home by 20 points. You can kind of see this like horizontal line corresponding to 0. And so like the vertical slice is like the outcome of the next game. It's a point differential. And so you can see that there's a lot of points above that 0 line, and there's a lot of points below that 0 line. A lot of teams that win by 20 points at home go on to get crushed in the next game. And it's surprising how often that happens. And that's what really populates some of this model. And so we can use logistic regressions. I use a simple statistical tool that works pretty well for this. And it says Wisconsin should get about 0.6 the win, so about 60% of that win. Right, and so I end up using that to supplement, come up with some of these partial votes in the Markov chain, and then I put it together with the rankings. And I'll skip all the details, but I promise it works. These are my rankings at the end of the basketball season last year. I had Wisconsin number 12, so not so bad. And I had North Carolina ranked number 1 and Gonzaga ranked number 2. And I think that these represent some pretty realistic rankings. And I don't even have to watch a game to come up with these rankings. It's just math, and that's beautiful. You should watch the games because it's a lot of fun. But it works pretty well. And so it's pretty interesting that we can get to this point with just a simple model without a lot of data requirements. All right, and then I won't talk too much about the college football playoff ranking, but I do look at the remainder of the season. And I've done this for 3 years now, and I've gotten the playoff right 3 years, at least near the end of the season, but even ahead of time. What's nice is that I can recognize the possibilities of what could happen way ahead of time. It's kind of exciting to see teams kind of get eliminated mathematically. Like Ohio State a couple years ago, and they lost to Michigan State. We could just kind of see that in the map, that their hopes they were really highly ranked, but they had like almost no chance of getting into the playoffs. And that's kind of fun to see. You get these extra insights from doing the math and crunching the numbers. All right, so I want to kind of wrap things up. There's a question first.
Do you have patent or copyright with it on this idea?
Oh no, I'm just a mere professor. I share everything openly. I don't know.
My point is, someone who went that in sports could pitch this model and use that for killing if it's restricted to that person.
It is not restricted. There's a lot of us crunching numbers and working models out there, so you could use it for betting. I don't bet. I just, right.
But someone else could take it.
Somebody else could take
And
it.
then copyright it, and then you could use it.
That's a good point. I'll have to think about it. I think I can prove that I came up with some of these ideas first. All right, so I want to wrap things up and talk a little bit about kind of the future and where things are going. So I want to come back to a couple of key points that I mentioned early on. And data is exciting, but it's just data. It's what you do with it that makes all the difference. And you can get information out of it, or you can go a little further and actually use it to design better systems. And that's really where the value of data comes in. And that's what a lot of us like to work on. I'm not so impressed with big data. This is my controversial statement of the night. There's controversy. I think big data is kind of overrated. It can be really useful, but not having a lot of data can be incredibly powerful too. And one of my colleagues, Professor John Calkins at Carnegie Mellon, does a lot of math modeling in illicit drug networks. And there's basically no data. So he has to go from 0 to just a few data points, and he's built very powerful models that have really made a difference in public policy. And he says you learn more from going from 0 to 100 data points than you do going from 100 million to 1 billion data points. So sometimes these emerging problems that we're solving, those first few data points, that when you move from maybe an anecdote or no data points to actually something, you can do something with that. And it's not really all about the data, it's about the models too. It's better to build simple models that are the right models that give you the right insights. And George E.P. Box is a legendary statistician who was affiliated with my department at UW-Madison. And the point is that they need to be useful. And we hear a lot about data science, and I've talked about this a little bit, about the advanced analytics, and that when you hear a lot about data science, a lot of it is just looking at this little piece of the system and maybe automating it and making it work really well. I have a beer recommender on my phone that one of my friends has designed at UW. And I could recommend you a beer. I could be totally wrong. But designing a system with all the interconnected parts is actually a little bit more complicated, and there are a lot of constraints. And it's hard to obey all of those constraints and keep everything in balance. All right, and I want to talk a little bit about technology since it's very disruptive, and we're talking about algorithms and math models. And I have some pictures of my favorite robots here, and one of my favorite Onion headlines of all time. That we are looking at a lot of automation, self-driving cars, drones. I'm waiting for my robot maid, but it really will be a lot of really will be a lot of disruption. But I do think that analytics is going to continue to be human-centered for the time being. There will still be some automation, but a lot of times we're seeing decisions supplemented with technology instead of totally replaced by technology. And I think that will continue for a while. A lot of my research inherently has somebody in the loop where somebody actually has to make that decision. UPS, somebody actually is delivering that package. Until we get all drone delivery, we're still going to see a lot more human to algorithm interaction than just humans being replaced. And so that's a lot of what we do as engineers, is try to get that part right and working well. I also talked about engineering being very forward-looking, but I also think it's very optimistic. And I like this quote that I've used in one of my classes in public sector operations research, and talked about planning in the emerging policy sciences, which is basically the public sector engineering of the time. And it mentioned that is one of the more optimistic of professions. I've always liked it because it's true. I mean, you wouldn't do it if you didn't think you could make a difference and make things better. And I think that's what engineering is all about quite often. And I needed a cat picture in my presentation. But this is just my opinion. I don't know, I could be wrong. I am grateful that you're here today. It was a really great audience. I didn't know if anybody was going to be interested, but I had a lot of fun being here. So thank you for coming today. I'm happy to answer any questions.
How can you apply this to the city?
Calming. I would like to improve the snow plowing routes, because I think my house is one of the last ones. Give me your card afterwards and I'm on it. I live in Middleton, so I have a vested interest. Great. There's a question in the back.
I'm curious about how much you do just in your head on a small scale, like you're at the grocery store and you look at the lines and then you find the shortest line. You're planning to go, the tomatoes are going here. Like, is it just all the time?
It's all the time. I mean, you gotta live, right? I like it. No, I do that. I was actually interviewed in a book that came out recently about all this stuff. It was I always forget the title. It's on my blog, but it's like algorithms for everyday living. And but I do this when I get my daughters out the door in the morning. I have 3 beautiful little girls, and I'm always trying to, project optimization is a thing. And I'm always trying to find the most critical path and like what needs to happen next. What's the most critical thing that needs to happen next? And it I don't know, it provides me some peace. So knowing that I'm efficient in the chaos. There's a question up front.
Would you describe the intersection between descriptive analytics and artificial intelligence and machine learning? Because now in the job market, everything is about machine learning and big data. So how do you adapt to that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, so the question was about kind of all the jobs. So there's a lot of jobs out there, and a lot. Okay, so I'm not right. So there are a lot of opportunities out there.
Mm-hmm. Is there an intersection between like statistics and machine learning? And I mean, is it evolving towards machine learning, you think, or should we all evolve towards that?
Oh, we need different. Oh yeah, that's a good question. So we need different people working on different things. It helps to know a little bit about a couple of those areas, but there's so many jobs and opportunities out there. So there are things in the intersection, there are things solely that are statistical or machine learning. There are things, not everybody should be doing advanced analytics. We have other problems to work on too. There's just an incredible opportunity right now in that space, everywhere in that space. Mm-hmm.
How do you relate to business school supply chain folks? Is that a competitor, or are you integrated?
Oh yeah, no, we're friends. We all get along. Actually the Informs that I mentioned is my professional society, it's the Institute for Operations Research and the Management Sciences. So we're all sort of merged together, and the top journals are the top journals between the two. So we have a little bit of a different focus, and the teaching is quite different, but a lot of collaborations are between business schools and engineering. That's a really great question. Mm-hmm.
How do you restrain the randomness of social science that comes into some of the decisions that people make, like hurricanes, for example, early on? Some people say that if rain comes up, you're not going to move, but that, in some cases they live in flood areas, and maybe they don't understand at this point that flooding can do a lot of damage to their person.
Right.
And so that the more, they just remember this awful travel. So that
Right.
changes the next decision.
It's beautiful. I mean, so the question was about social science, and you have to know about that. So one of my colleagues, who's a civil engineer, did some pioneering work on hurricanes, and she took her way of taking the social science into account, because it is crazy if you look at evacuation. Why don't people evacuate? Well, they've got pets, they can't stay at the hospital, they're trying to reunite with family, they're not going to evacuate until they're reunited with their family. So you have to know about all those factors, people with disabilities. And so she really worked on, instead of evacuating people, the focus was getting people to safety and just changing the framework. And that way she could take all those things into account and look at designing better systems. But you really have to know that. And I can't be an expert in sociology and social systems, but I can work with people who are. That's a good question. Do you have a question?
What to think about the artificial intelligence, its impact on moral building, data science, and optimization?
I'm pretty excited. I mean, I've been a little underwhelmed, but when they had algorithms winning at Go this past year, I mean, we're seeing some huge breakthroughs that I think could possibly, really sophisticated algorithms. I'm pretty excited and optimistic about the next 10 years. A lot of what we've seen in the past, what if students work on are models that say, should I make this person a loan, yes or no? And it hasn't always been incredibly sophisticated in that area. But we're getting a lot better at some of those things. And I think there's another part to your question that I didn't fully understand about the model building.
We are building the models, we need the data.
Mm-hmm.
Data needs to be collected. That is, most of the collection will be automated now,
Mm-hmm.
using the AI and sensors.
Oh, right.
What kind of impact it has on the operation as a case?
As a case, yeah. So a lot of times we use all that data as inputs, and I think we could be a little bit more sophisticated in that. I mean, there's just so much data out there, and somehow it has to be synthesized and get into the model. And so sometimes those processes are a little bit separate. And I think we have more opportunities to do more sophisticated parts with the data-driven part. And there's some exciting topics coming out that are sort of related to that in terms of functional optimization. I think you are potentially a retired operations research professor. Is that true? So we have somebody's fact checking here. No, that's great. That's why. No, it's an exciting audience. So I think, I think I would like to sit down and talk with you about that some other time.
Thank you.
All right,